Is this an anti-science piece? A hit piece on science perhaps? Perhaps to each. Call it corrective corporal punishment.
Ahistorical Narratives.
The first point, and it's a doozy of a point, is the ahistoricism of science. In the current, modern times, especially with the advent of the tools of mass delusions, mass communications, we've come to a point whereby the scientific prophets are proselytizing about the history of science stretching back thousands of years. Nay, since the dawn of humanity. Though there are many examples to point to in the current times, with all the various online content on the point, I want to direct folks' attention to a current standard bearer or two, Neil deGrasse Tyson, R.V. Dawkins, and Bill Nye, the science guy. And I almost immediately want to hedge a bit on it, and note that I personally enjoyed watching their various scientific content. Good stuff. At least parts of it. Though R.V. Dawkins has always been pretty abrasive to listen to. Zero charisma, that one. Alas, they also put forth ahistorical narratives about the supposed deep history of science. This narrativized version of history holds that there were scientists, and then there were proto-scientists, those evolutionarily prior to, and lesser than scientists, whom nonetheless we thank for their being, kinda right, but really wrong. And then there is everyone else. All those wrong people in history. See for relevant instance the Cosmos series, but really I just suggest spending a bit of time watching their various content, and indeed, the content of other science-oriented types to get a sense of the issues involved. Likewise, pay attention to what may be taught in the public schooling, or online schooling curriculums. This ahistorical take on things is critical for the current scientific delusion, as it holds that ultimately there never were any other viewpoints, no other non-scientific viewpoints, modes of knowledge creation, having, or understanding, at least not any worthwhile. If, after all, they were worthwhile, then they would be proto-scientific viewpoints. Am I right? Can I get an amen? For the folks thoroughly caught up in the scientific delusion, this has entailed such things as claiming that natural philosophers were actually proto-scientists, not philosophers as they would have described themselves. Likewise, religious thinkers who held to some kind of intellectual standard were actually proto-scientists utterly unbeknownst to them. And they gained this moniker in virtue of them contributing to the scientific project. People who discovered something about the world, or invented something, were actually doing science. The folks who discovered fire, they were scientists. Those who invented the wheel, scientists, or at least proto-scientific, at the very least when they invented that thing, they were definitely doing science right then. Did you discern the world through reason? Nope. You did it via science, you were just too stupid to realize it at the time, don't you see? Let me clean your eyes a bit for you, so you can see better the gospel of Sir R.V. Dawkins. Never mind that none of these folks thought of themselves as scientists. Never mind that there was no such thing as science at the time. Never mind that the folks who developed these things gave very different explanations as to how they developed what they developed and spoke of it differently. Never mind that the knowledge they brought to the table was valuable. In each case, what was valuable was the scientific lore. The ahistorical narrative of science goes so far as to claim that ancient philosophies and mathematical cults were actually proto-scientists. It's true. They weren't really philosophers, nay, they were Homo scientis erectus pontificus. A heretofore unknown species of scientists the scientists themselves discovered by reading their works for the first time. Dazzled by the wisdoms contained therein, they pondered and wondered to themselves how might these primitive ancients develop something sans science? Obviously, there is only one solution. They were actually scientists, of course. Vast swaths of human thought that have existed for thousands of years derivative of and utilizing these thinkers of olden times, morons. What could those non-scientists possibly know anyway? Indeed, it's even worse than this, for the true delusional scientist holds that in actuality evolutionarily distant ancestors, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years ago, were actually proto-scientists. All of human lore, knowledge, understanding, all of it of any worth that is, actually stemming on an unbroken chain of scientific thought stretching back thousands, perhaps millions of years. All to bring forth the smiling visage of the modern scientist, delusional in their understanding of things, really the torch-bearers of light, life, liberty, and all things good and wholesome.
Just a brief bit on the history of science.
So, if not that, and clearly it is not that delusion that is the species' history, what is the history of science? Roughly like many things, it stems as an outgrowth of philosophy, specifically Greek philosophy, and stems from the Aristotelian line of thinking, though that is all fairly much together with the Platonic and mathematical line of thinking. Each of these stretching back, well, actually thousands of years. What the scientists are referring to when they refer to proto-scientific man are tendencies in these philosophical lines of thought to adhere their theorizing to the observable reality. It isn't until Descartes that you get modern philosophical thought. And it is philosophical thought. Folks are likely most familiar with Descartes via the Cartesian plane in mathematics, and the famous quote, "I think therefore I am." While we could expand upon this a great deal, including the role of the church and the mosque in developing and maintaining these lines of thought, I want to, unlike my delusional scientific counterparts, focus on the actual line of scientific thinking, as opposed to an ahistorical narrative. Yes, there is more history to it. Yes, oh my yes, the Islamic and Catholic traditions, including their religious thought, played a significant role in maintaining and developing the relevant lines of thinking. Moreover, there are a plethora of figures of import, not just Descartes. Consider Descartes a point of interest, a figure and perhaps a figurehead, a symbol for a change in the general mood and mode of thinking. But what we do get with Descartes is something fairly well identifiable as the modern scientific modality of thought. Though to be clear, Descartes wasn't a scientist, nor was he a proto-scientist. He was a philosopher. Stemming from Descartes you get a line of thought, that is, a dialogue that occurs with successive philosophers, as they would have called themselves, discussing Descartes' work, building on it, and maintaining it. Such eventuates in the natural philosophers who do actually have something akin to a scientific understanding of the world, though it is not considered by them to be the only or perhaps even most meaningful mode of thinking. Here the species get such supposed scientific luminaries as Galileo, Copernicus, and Newton. Each of these would have thought of themselves and named themselves natural philosophers or just philosophers, not scientists. The term scientist wasn't even coined until 1833, according to the internets at any rate, but regardless of the exact date of its first use, it wasn't really used as a separable conceptual kind of thing from philosophers until around that time. What you do have then and prior to then is something like the scientific method we'd recognize today as a tool folks used, that is, philosophers and theologians, thinkers, used to gather data about the world to try and weed out various hypotheses. Likewise, you get a variety of folks actively experimenting in a manner we these days likely call doing experimental science. Still yet, none of these were proto-scientists. Again, the term as such didn't even exist. No one at the time thought of themselves in that manner, and the methodologies, modality of thinking, and various intellectual practices were not all scientific. To be clear there, these were not scientists, they were philosophers and perhaps more pointedly natural philosophers who did not think in modern scientific terms, and yet nonetheless they developed useful things, thoughts, ideas, and so forth. The delusional scientists of today would have you believe that either these were actually proto-scientists, or that the only aspects of their works that were useful were the proto-scientific pieces, or some other such nonsense so as to utterly dismiss all non-scientific thinking as primitive, wrong, silly, and so forth. Even in the 1800s we still did not get a mass of scientists, that is, folks who are actually calling themselves scientists, devoting themselves to scientific thought to the exclusion of other modes of thinking, and indeed, really even well-defined disciplines of scientific thinking at all. That doesn't really happen for another century. It isn't until the 1900s, the early 1900s, but still the 20th century that the folks actually doing the labor formally split from philosophy. Rather pointedly, I personally like to note that the proper point of departure being the debate between Einstein and Bergson, April 6, 1922. If folks look it up, they will find the debate was famous as Einstein defeated Bergson in the debate, which was important because Bergson was something of the standard bearer for philosophy, and Einstein for science. Up to that point, philosophy was considered the proper intellectual mode, to put it a bit loosely. The point there being rather specifically that between the coining of the term scientist in 1833 and the debate about a century later, you have a significant break, a schism that forms between science and philosophy, Prior to that, all thinkers would have referred to themselves, thought of themselves, studied, and actively participated in philosophy, not science. In that century interim before the schism, it's more complicated, with the educated classes taking more or less to science or philosophy or mathematics, and guessed. Not surprisingly, it is then that we really see a significant increase in what we would today consider scientific thinking as something occurring distinctly from philosophical or mathematical thinking. It is then too that we begin to see a greater economic interest in the development of technology. No, technology is not science. It is then that we can really begin to speak of the history of science. Perhaps not directly at the supposed coining time of the term itself, but rather with the active attempts to schism the intellectual process towards the eventuation of there being a scientific discipline that is distinct from, in particular, philosophy and mathematics. That may occur a bit prior to the coining of the term, and it will be a rather messy and vague definition, but certainly it doesn't stem into the thousands of years prior to. Likewise, while we must and fuss over the exact date at which the schism occurred, the noted Bergson-Einstein debate carries a lot of the relevant hallmarks, and may suffice well simply as a not entirely arbitrary point at which science as a discipline emerged from philosophy. There is a common argument and disposition regarding the origins of science, that Newton was the first scientist properly speaking. Maybe even more pointedly, that the publication of Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica actually marks the scientific revolution in a more formal sense. I'd note that even the title belies that notion, and merely highlights the reality that Newton was a philosopher and a mathematician. He thought in that manner, wrote in that manner, taught in that manner, studied in the manner, not in the manner of scientific thought. That said, the notion is that the scientific method, properly speaking, doesn't really formally get structured until around this time. To be clear there, the methodology that underpins science in general wasn't even a formally structured thing until around this time. Newton, it is claimed, is the person who most famously, firstly, formally utilizes it. In this view, we might hold that the schisming began then, and didn't reach its fullest until the Einstein-Bergson debate. Still, even if we grant this point, we're only talking about 1687. In other words, nothing at all like the current delusional thinking that scientific thought stretches back thousands, even millions of years. I'd go so far as to strongly suggest that the delusional thinking involved in holding that kind of thousands of years old tradition is internally inconsistent with the current scientific understanding of how evolutionary processes work. For one, they don't lead to anything in particular. There isn't a progressive line of thought that happens, there is just differing lines of thought that occur relative to the context in which they occur, and they have some degree of power and control over the contexts in which they occur, i.e. they are alive active things in the world, not merely passive pieces. For two, meaningful distinctions matter in evolutionary processes. While there is vagueness between iterations of a genetic line, there are meaningfully distinct things to say about any given iteration thereof. Likewise for any sensible understanding of the history of ideas, including the history of scientific thought. Note that this is a fairly well understood kind of thing in the philosophies, that is, there are well-defined branches and schools of thought in philosophy, even if the definitions are somewhat vague, overlapping, etc. Nonetheless, they clearly delineate meaningfully differentiable modes of thinking. Witfully noting that science is oft and perhaps aptly simply viewed as one of those branches of philosophical thinking. Point being, it isn't really that difficult, folks.
Pretense of importance. The arbitrary meaning of the good.
Was that a good idea? Must have been science. This aspect is rather insidious, for it ultimately tries to hold that any good idea, any idea that was correct, useful, worthwhile, etc., was actually a scientific idea. In the current, this is happening with mathematics in particular, perhaps also a good deal with technological development. Mathematics isn't really a science, it has almost no characteristics that are scientific. Indeed, even in theory, to have it be a science entails holding at the least a Platonic position, a non-scientific position, regarding the existence of actual numbers as abstracted entities, in other words, Platonic forms. At the most, a full-on Pythagorean cultish viewpoint that the world is actually made of numbers, geometric forms, etc. Only if we make those distinctly non-scientific claims can we thereby hold that there is a thing out there in the world for science to science itself to. Alas, turns out though that mathematics is useful, it actually does something of use. hence, must be science. Moreover, mathematics turns out to be useful to science, to the scientist, as a means of measuring, collecting data, and perhaps too, theorizing and so forth. Must be science. When a philosopher picks up a hammer, they don't thereby transmutate philosophy into construction work. Logic? What of that? So distinctly a philosophical practice, it practically conjures up images of philosophers just by saying the word, almost like magic. Logic, and poof, before your mind's eye you see the philosopher. Alas, this too is science. It was too good an idea, you see, so after all this too must actually be scientific. You see, after all, scientific thought utilizes logical thinking, and so we must acquire such things to our own brand name, scientifically of course. And just like magic, thus the scientist pretends that they are logicians too. Thus they pretend that logic actually was never philosophy. We were all foolish for ever thinking otherwise, were we not? That philosopher you see, that was actually a scientist properly speaking. By properly speaking I mean scientifically speaking. Those two being synonymous, how could they not after all? To speak properly is to speak scientifically, whatever else could it ever mean or have ever meant? Meme? What that? What that philosopher say? Meme? Mimetic? Aesthetic? Mimetic say what? Was that a philosophical thing? Nah, that wasn't a philosopher who said that. Was it? I mean, what a meme that is, a very selfish kind of meme indeed. I poke too much fun at it. The notion, though, is so old it is hardly a novel concept by its supposed originator, the Dawkins, and to his credit, he admits this, though his knowledge of the history of the topic is so limited as to be somewhat useless. Namely, his knowledge of the topic is limited to scientific lore, he being, after all, a scientist. Likewise to his credit, as far as I know, he did in fact coin the term meme. One can find the concept in philosophy of aesthetics, does art imitate life, or life imitate art? The phrase itself ought to be sufficient, and I am not, utterly fucking refusing to provide sources, learn to read you shitheads. But just consider what kind of conversations that popular phrase induces. How people imitate the art they see, or how the art they see imitates them. Sounds very mimetic to me, does it not to thee? But not just there. Consider the notions of mass hysteria and mass delusions, looking at the scientists here ATM, and mind viruses. These are not any of them new concepts, and not a one of them stems from science of scientific lore. Likewise, just vaguely and please not overly seriously, consider the entire disciplines of rhetoric and politics. Practically the entire fields there are about memetics, that is, how ideas, thoughts, bits of culture, transmit between people. Such practically defines rhetoric. Indeed, folks interested could bother to read The Sophist by Plato to get a good sense of just how old that notion really is. Ah, but all those were actually proto-scientists after all. So says the R. of Dawkins, the biliest of Nias, what a science that guy, and the DeGrasse himself, as himself, Neil Tyson. In the currents, need we really state all the stolen knowledge from the indigenous peoples? Folks do get that point these days, right? Still, let me qualify, explain, and clarify it a bit. I put scare quotes on stolen because, well, knowledge is and ought to be free. It is a fucking travesty to humanity that folks actually sell the stuff, guard and hoard it like little pretenders to a throne. Still, the word stolen does have meaningful context and import here. After all, to those who stole it, the knowledge indeed was sellable, and hence, therefore, because of that fact, was also stealable. To them, to those who stole it, such was indeed a theft. In their little hearts they may have even understood this point. They may have felt they were taking advantage of someone, stealing their knowledge, and then going to marketplace to sell it. More than this, though, is the pretense and pretending of the lore as if it were scientific lore. That's a mighty fine-looking medicine you got there. Mind if I pretend that I discovered it? Here there is perhaps more a theft without the scare quotes, though it is an odd one to be sure. The questionable questions of the cultural theft, how does one steal a culture, is a bit odd. As I said, knowledge, including cultural knowledge, ought to be free, and traditionally was exactly free. It is a certain kind of person who holds otherwise, and through their holding to that other-than-wise position that they create the conditions whereby a culture can be stolen. Still, there is something more there. Specifically, that pretense of the knowledge as if it actually originated with the scientist, with science. The medicine they learned from the indigenous peoples, who were not scientific, that is, they didn't garner that knowledge through anything akin to a formal scientific process, becomes poof like science. Why? Again, it was a good idea, a nice mean you got there, hence, therefore, because of that fact, it must be science. If not, then what are we even saying? Can we even speak properly without science after all? Now, I do actually think it worthwhile to temper that point just a bit. For the folks in the olden times, specifically during the European colonial era and earlier, to come back from some far distant land with a bit of cool lore was actually a rather big fucking deal. Trading between bioregions, cultural lore, literal seeds for growing foods, trading medicines, etc., these are frankly wonderful things. Moreover, everyone actually benefited from this trading. Yes, there were a lot of horrors involved too, no denying that, hiding from it, nor would I personally want to, nor do I feel the need to for that matter. The point though is that for folks in those olden times, traveling was extremely dangerous, exploring was something noble, though being an explorer didn't necessarily mean one was noble, good, etc. Trading goods around the globe was something quite valuable, laudable even, for everyone involved, though again, there are lots of other less desirable aspects to that too. For here though the point is that such actions in those times have a kind of quality of discovery to them that just isn't present in the current. Not merely for those who did the traveling either, also for those who were brave enough to greet and treat them well. Those who did the trading, did the heartfelt and hard work of interacting with the heretofore unknown. But let's be clear here, none of that lore originated via science. Science cataloged it, categorized it, and then made pretense to it as if it were its own. The knowledge itself, however, was not scientifically derived. Unless, oh wait, I think I see the science guy coming. Shucksy dang diddly doop, turns out I was wrong, and all that knowledge was actually derived by secret proto-scientists in each and every culture. Diversities matter after all. Science, understand, isn't a European invention, all evidence to the contrary aside. Science is a universal human endeavor that all cultures throughout all of history have practiced. To be clear, the ancient Mayans weren't primitive, they were proto-scientists. To hold otherwise would be racist. Couldn't, after all, be the case that they were neither primitive nor proto-scientists, cause clearly all their lore, knowledge, understanding, etc., is good, and we know for a fact that all good knowledge, maybe all good things at all for all anywhere, come from science. Science doesn't, after all, stem from Descartes, that would be Eurocentric, and we all know nothing good came from Europe, am I right, buddies? That would be racist AF to think that something might have originated in Europe, let alone originate by a white-ish guy, and for fuck's sake a philosopher too. How bad is it really? I digress. The point is that we all know for a fact that science didn't originate in Europe, nor for that matter was it birthed in the churches and mosques, midwifed by philosophers. Bah, that's crazy talk. Everyone is a scientist. Ancient Chinese? Yes please. Kushites, Forshuriites. Ocean-hopping Polynesians? Scientifically please NM. Native Americans of all stripes? Scientific sound bites. Neanderthals? Oh my yes, how could they not be scientific, y'all? You see, you must see, after all, that it would be racist AF to think that those folks were stupid, primitive, that they might have learned anything at all from the Europeans would put a pox upon thee. These folks, therefore, hence, because of such fine reasoning, must have been scientists. Philosophers too. They too must have an analog to the Platonic dialogues, to the Pythagorean cults. They simply must, mustn't they? I mean, that is how racism works, am I right? Atomic theory. This is quite literally just about 3,000 years old. It is a pre-Socratic philosophical theory that holds that things are made up of smaller things, that the proper ontological entity is not the composite rock, but rather the individual atoms that comprise it. That there is something more fundamental to the rock than its coarse and crude first-pass appearance. Indeed, that the shape of those atomic structures determines their capacity to formally structure the larger scalar aspects. There are other theories about such things from those times, including what is likely the more familiar. It's all made up of the fundamental elements take on it, but the point is that that theory is old, very old, not scientifically derived, and was promulgated within the Academy since the inception of the Academy. It was not, in other words, a theory that any scientist derived. It was not derived in the modern era. Far from it. Scientists used the existing theory to posit more precise theories about it, and utilized newfangled tools to be able to make observations. Again, the point though isn't that science does nothing, is not useful, etc. The point is that non-scientific thinking is actually useful, has done things, is worthwhile. That science isn't the one, true and only. Alas though, again, gosh darn it, turns out I am mistaken. Those dang diddly scientists. They actually derived the theory whole cloth themselves in 1919, everyone else prior to that were morons after all. Indeed, Democritus, his atomic theory, all his pre-Socratic buddies gabbing about all the different possibilities for what those gosh darn little things might look like, they were all of them actually ancient science brought to Earth via aliens. Astronomy. Oh my, that one. How long and oft have the species from all cultures gazed upon the stars? Measured and counted their movements? That one since time immemorial. That one since the species first gazed upwards. That one indeed for a very long time, to the prehistory for sure, to the supposed evolutionary origins of the species, to other species even. That one, the capacity to gaze upon the stars, to count them, to note their passage, to make basic observations, to actually have the audacity to utilize one's eyes to see things, that of course was actually all science. Am I right? Can I get another amen? How about a hallelujah this time? Like, those ancient peoples in the genes, long before Homo sapien, they too were actually scientists. Citizen scientists even. And the leopards, the elephants, the donkeys, the birds too, these other animals that dare to gaze upon the sky from time to time and ponder something, they too are scientists. Deep thinkers they are. Woe be thee who think other than we. We who? I'll talk, or scientists be thee we I think. Gasp, what if the animals actually think some too? Like, they pay attention to the stars' movements, maybe the sun and the moon's movements too. Oh look, they do, it's clear as day, at least as clear as the moon, they too are scientists. Oh my, turtle scientists. Citizen turtle scientists abound. Science, oh ye science is everywhere, alas, not a drop of wisdom to drink. Okay, so maybe in all those instances there is a problem. Maybe it is the case that there used to be wisdom, knowledge, lore, that developed via means other than science. They weren't proto-scientists, they weren't scientists in waiting, they were some other sort of being who developed them. But clearly there is something to what science is doing, right? I mean, there is clearly something that science is doing that distinguishes it from non-science. Yes, and some of that we'll get to in the next section. But there are some additional confusions, conflations, and cons going on with the scientific air of importance and the claiming of the good. To be blunt and aptly so, the process of science in the current looks a lot like that of natural philosophers of the past. There are different tools being used, modern machinery, modern methods of measurement, but I am not really seeing particularly well how science has meaningfully distinguished itself from natural philosophers beyond a shifting of names. There are a few things of names, naming as if of importance. The renaming, really a rebranding of the natural philosophers as if they were scientists, and indeed, not just the natural philosophers, but all and any sort of thought, thinking, etc., that is useful, good, as if it were science. These are among the key points of the serious problem with the sciences. There is, however, a deeper problem for the sciences, one that they can really handle super well. It's still just a rock, y'all. You can rename it, you can specify it to your little heart's content, you can dissect it, chop it up, rebrand it in this or that manner, and yet it is still just a rock. There isn't necessarily anything particularly good or novel about naming conventions, they being, after all, just naming conventions. Roses by names other than these, still be yonder roses that please. I don't want to suggest that there is nothing at all to such practices, but gosh dang it all dears, it really is still just a rock. To attempt to derive novelty from a rebranding, a renaming is not anything, worthwhile. Wherefore do the ideas stem? When yon scientist ponders deeply on something, how are they not a philosopher? When they conjure via thin air some theory, maxim, or axiom of form, how are they doing so scientifically and not actually philosophically? My best guess, my best philosophical interpretation of the relevant data regarding such things, is the reliance on following the data rather than bothering to philosophically ruminate upon such things as foresight, ethics, reasonableness, and interpretations of the data. A more formal method of defining science is via the scientific method. Anything that doesn't formally follow the scientific method isn't science. Such is similar to the notion follow the data, though the latter is a bit of an oversimplification. Things of significant note therein, again, logic, reason, rationality, mathematics, philosophical ruminations, theological thinking, these are not science by this understanding. Which, they ain't. The issue in the current is science's pretense to importance as if it were in point of fact all of these, which of course it isn't.
Denial of reality.
Oh, this one is fairly difficult for folks, as it entails a kind of horror to them. Taking either date so noted. Perhaps it is the earlier date, perhaps it is the later date. What happened during the period of time that the sciences schismed from the philosophies? Divorced as best they could from the philosophical ruminations about interpretations, a posteriori considerations only please. Weapons of mass destruction. Mechanized murderous methodologies to massacre en masse. Modalities of industrialization that industrialize misery. The distinctive lacking of an ethical compass to thought, let alone anything akin to a theorizing apparatus that may stem a priori or towards some heretofore unknown. Among the greatest eras of misery, the global colonialistic era. Blindness. A narrow-minded focus upon that which is before their eyes, blinders blinding them to the realities of the things they do. Knowledge, of a very particular kind, for the knowledge's sake, for the sake of, that is, a very particular kind of being. The pillaging of peoples, lores, eradications of cultures under the guise of benevolent being. The ravenous rampaging rape to reap every grain of salt on a salty earth. Whole ecosystems destroyed, brought nigh low unto extinction, or near enough to it, with nary a thought given to it. Were these things connected? I mean, it could of course via logic, reason, rationale thought be mused and mussed around some as to if these kinds of developments were linked. That is, the attempting to divorce science from philosophy, the schism, the development of the scientific method, and all these horrors that follow. Is it a case merely of contemporaneous events? Possibly. I think certainly it is the case that the issue is more complex than this, but such more complexity doesn't thereby absolve the sciences, the scientific method. There are far and away far too many clear ringing bells of evidence to the culpability of science and the scientific method to merely discount the whole affair. Too many examples, that is, of scientific racism, the scientific colonialistic attitude, the scientists who utilize their skills towards exactly the ends mentioned. Enough that, it is enough to seriously consider that the scientific methodology itself may be a root structural cause. See also The Odd Questions of Privilege, a slight history of colonialism where an argument is laid out for such a position. For here, let me say, I recall having to actually argue, with people that extinction of species, destruction of an ecosystem, eradication of a culture were bad things. After all, they were merely calling the good to themselves, am I right? Where's my fucking amen? Claiming as the good themselves, and pretending that therefore, because of that fine bit of reasoning, hence that what they do must too be the good, the righteous, the magnanimous sort of thing to do. If a few species and ecosystems happen to perish, alas, they must have deserved it. Progress is progress, after all, and all progress is good, and indeed, all good is definitionally scientific, and hence, need we really carry forth that bit of associative scientific reasoning for you? Now, to the delusional scientist, they will hold steadfastly that, alas, that actually wasn't science. That was something else. That was human nature, that was science in service of evil or science in the service of something else, that wasn't actually science. After all, science is good, science is knowledge, science is your friend, science doesn't purport to, for instance, murder people. It doesn't advocate for those things. Those things are advocated for by other people, for other reasons, for other means and ends than science. Such is oft the claim of the guilty, the fairly classic dispositions even, to claim in pretense as that which is good for thyself, and to claim in pretense as that which is bad for those people over there. It is an altogether sad, pathetic sort of thing. Sure, there are plenty of examples to counter those scientists' defense that it wasn't really science. Gosh, it's actually kind of difficult to find examples that support that point. But I think what they mean to say, what's in their little hearts, is something like the following. Knowledge for knowledge's sake is good. At least not an obviously flawed disposition. Bravo, I commend you. Science is the only true knowledge, or perhaps more gently, insidiously phrased, science is the best source of producing true knowledge the species currently has. Ouch, terrible, absolutely terrible belief. But definitely what they are holding to. Therefore, it couldn't possibly be science that is the cause of all those bad things. After all, knowledge is good, and science is the best of knowledge. Science is your friend. Don't you like your friends? Those things are bad, and therefore those things aren't science's fault, even though science definitively produced them. This, of course, is a terrible bit of reasoning. The reality is that science is amoral, aethical. It has literally no moral compass whatsoever. It holds up a rock and proclaims that rock. It has no disposition towards it one way or another. Thus is science. If someone were to come upon and chide them as they proudly hold aloft the rock they definitely just discovered for the first time by saying that's a musical instrument, the scientist would be baffled, utterly baffled by the claim. It is clearly a rock, nothing more, nothing less. If said person displayed to them how you can bang those rocks together to make music, firstly the scientifically minded folks would look at you amazed. How the fuck did you do that? That's just a rock, and quickly follow this exclamation with these: witch, wizard, warlock, demon, evil, get thee out. After all, a posteriori is what they got. Then they grab that rock, try to make music themselves, do it poorly, proclaim that they discovered music, and bash you over the head to death for your troubles. Such is, after all, the scientific method. No morals, no ethics, no imagination, no musings, no guiding principles beyond knowledge for knowledge's sake. And not just any knowledge, scientific knowledge. All other knowledge is bad, no. Such is a posteriori knowledge. Science is brutish, mean, and short-lived. It proclaims itself a victor for having vanquished an enemy it never had. It holds with all seriousness that folks don't understand that that is a rock over there, unless and until they too proclaim it rock from a scientific vantage point. They will hold your feet to the fire, pry your eyes open, deny you rest, until you make the proclamation too. It isn't enough to say, of course that is a rock, what the fuck do you think it is? You have to say, I see now. The scientific fact has delivered upon mine eyes the divine, the holy message. It is a rock. Atomic weapons, not atomic theory, brought to you via science. Chemical and biological weapons and warfare, not theory, brought to you via science. Ecological destruction, not ecological theory, brought to you via science. So, after all, what the fuck is science?
Parsimony.
Science is just a method of investigation about the world. Rather specifically, about the a posteriori structures of the world. It doesn't and indeed cannot deduce first principles. It may or may not think that it can, that is, individual scientists may or may not think that they can. But actually they cannot. Insofar as scientists do deduce such things, they aren't really practicing or utilizing science. They may utilize math, not a science, or logic, not a science, or perhaps they may utilize such things as intuition, free will to choose, etc. What they cannot do, not merely definitionally but in simple point of fact, is deduce first principles. This does beg a bit the question regarding what are first principles, and alas, I mostly am not going to answer that here. Read books, people. What I will do is denote again the glaringly obvious points of facts that mathematics, logic, reason, rationality, and emotional structures are not deduced via science. At the very most, we might say something like science can give us some insight into the nature of these things, but they existed before science, they exist independent of science, and they are not reducible to the scientific method. But here, in the point of parsimony, I want to also bring forth again and more forcefully so to light the problems within science as a practice. Not, that is, as a methodology. There isn't anything so obviously wrong with the scientific method. But there are aspects of such profound importance to the problems with the practice of science that they really ought not be ignored. Firstly, perhaps most importantly, science is aethical. It is an amoral thing. It does not care about your feelings. It doesn't really care about any ethics at all. It is scientific, knowledge for knowledge's sake. There are reasons why scientists actively produce weapons of mass destruction. They've zero moral compass. In this regard, everyone ought seriously look at the scientific community with rather extreme skepticism. 'Cause it isn't just weapons of mass destruction. A scientist will science anything. When it's sciencized, it is put into an aethical and amoral position. Indeed, doing so used to be understood as an aim and a boon of science. This is why scientists especially are able to justify the most heinous of actions on a whim. If the data says it's so, then it must be so. Potentially this could be fine. For reals. It could be the case that the data really does say it is so, and so it, well, if not must at least ought be so. However, but, big O buts here, huge asses coming through, this seriously depends on if the data actually entails something ethical. To quote the philosophers, is does not imply ought. There is no world in which data on its own tells us what we ought to do. Now, it could be the case though that the data indeed so happens to actually entail the correct ought. As in, the data actually so happens to inform us of the ethical or moral thing to do. That is a possibility. Not because the data entailed or logically deduced the ethical stance, but rather because the data just so happened to inform correctly on the matter. We might even hold such as being indicative of an objective morality of some kind. But here the point rather specifically is that to merely follow the data is oft historically, and in the current, exactly not the moral or ethical thing to do. Moreover, it may not even realistically inform well as to what anyone ought to do. It could, it is at least a technical possibility. But typically it doesn't. Worse still, simply following the data can lead to disastrously wrong results. Secondly, tailing firstly, the notion of simply following the data masks rather huge issues with the pragmatics involved in doing that. This ought not be taken lightly in any way, shape, or form. Scientists are people. It isn't just that they make errors, it is that they carry within them various biases. Moreover, it is that science usually isn't done in a vacuum. Big money, big gov, big corp, all play big-ass roles in the collection, interpretations, and dissemination of data. This isn't a trivial matter either. More than merely what questions are asked being largely determined by those big three, what answers are provided is likewise determined. Either by outright data manipulation, fraud, cherry-picking, p-hacking, etc., or by simply choosing to not report the findings if they are inconvenient. Now, folks may be inclined to again say something like, oh, well sure, maybe in those cases, but not my precious science in general. But yeah, sorry y'all, it's your precious science in general. Turns out you cannot actually disentangle the scientists from the science. You cannot simply remove these other sorts of influences upon science. More than a technical problem, or a problem of degrees, it is a systemic problem that cuts to the heart of scientific credibility. Folks have been outright warning, sounding the alarm bells on these issues loudly in and outside of the academy for decades now, really depending on how you cut the point, more than a century. Scientists, however, are aethical and amoral monstrosities, so they simply ignore it. I want to be clear on this point. The science is bad. It is so bad that it quite literally ought not be trusted. It is unclear, for instance, what bedrock foundations of the current science are predicated upon basically scientific bullshit. How many foundational papers from, say, 70 years ago were actually bullshit? How many from 50 years ago? 20? A decade ago? I don't suspect it is a small number. And of course, how many of the papers that followed in their footsteps, that took those previous papers for simple fact, now are highly questionable themselves. Being predicated upon false assumptions entails not being able to derive true conclusions. That logic, y'all. Nor is this just the soft sciences. The hard sciences suffer greatly from this issue. Again, some of this is a matter of what do we care about? As in, is the science on weapons of mass destruction sound? Perhaps. Could be. Should we actually want that? Should we be doing that at all? Should we trust in the people who actually sit around and dream that stuff up? But of course it is far worse than that. It is also, how many papers lied? How many people believed that lie and based their other papers on it? How many, for instance, medicines are on the market that are actually either not really effective or are not nearly as effective as they claim to be? How many are actively harmful? How many medicines are created not to cure the problem but to merely sell the products? How many chemicals produced despite actually knowing, that they are harmful to people? How many chemicals produced masking that point? How many chemicals produced that are predicated upon good enough understandings of the underlying chemical structures? How many abstract notions presented in the plethora of journals that are never really tested but are assumed that they are? How many of those are simply lies or presentations of the manipulations of data? Here I want to be super honest about it. When it comes to something like abstracted particle physics, for instance, aside from the math of it, it really is a lot of data interpretations. Interpretations and experiments that are extremely difficult to replicate. The point there being that contrary to what appears to be in the common discourse, something abstract like particle physics is very susceptible to data mining, p-hacking, data manipulation, and outright fraud. Who's gonna test a seemingly minor claim being made, or a claim that conforms to the standard model? An outrageous claim, one that is groundbreaking, maybe that'll get checked. But a modest claim? One that cements certain predispositions that exist? Oh, look at my not so surprising claim I found that just so happens to fit the models we all already think are correct. Cool, huh? Now publish my paper and give me prestige. And look, these are not baseless accusations. These are serious fucking issues in the sciences. Moreover, the history of science actually bears this out. Look at the record of it: mass deaths, outright horrors of racism, medical horrors of live dissections, medicines that actually do harm to people. The list is really long, y'all. In each and every one of those instances, I guarantee you that the scientists involved were merely espousing commonly held views, not merely about the society at large, but about the science itself. Views that advance the field modestly by presenting findings that just so happen to reinforce the prevailing view in society and within the science itself. Such is, after all, the insidiousness of the problem. How many scientific papers were there on the flatness of the earth, I wonder? How many on the health benefits of Teflon? Tobacco? Booze? Coffee? Radiation? Lead? Mercury? How many scientific papers that lied about the effects of various chemicals to uphold preconceived notions? How many scientific papers denied climate change until others noted it? How many scientific papers defended the positions we just so happen to no longer believe ATM? None of these are small in numbers. Few of these were found out via science neither. Rather, there were non-scientists who tended to sound the alarm. An outsider's view who looked upon the situation and bothered to say something. For sure, some of these were developed via the journalistic peer review and competitive systemization. Some of these were resolved, that is, via the scientific method. Thirdly, also trailing on secondly, there are rather massive issues of built-up terminology, errors, and beliefs in science. Here I mean specifically that there are concepts, phrases, and terms that are themselves erroneous and or merely beliefs in the scientific lit, which have been built into the data sets folks use. This largely has to do with how one thinks about or understands any given set of data, or indeed, even any given data point. The Rape of the Swan gives a good rundown of the specific examples related to data on instances of sexual assault, rape, and sexual harassment. Here I want to expand on that and note that similar issues arise in all the scientific lit. In essence, differing naming conventions regarding what constitutes a given thing can and often enough are used to change the meaning and interpretation of data. This aspect I think may actually be more prevalent in the soft sciences, but I am unsure of it. It is certainly easier to spot there. How does one categorize race, for instance? Of sex? Sexuality? Nationality? How does one categorize political leanings? behavior, someone's opinions, their thoughts. All of these terms are inherently rather extremely vague. How one terminologically classifies these things ultimately and rather radically determines the answers. One can literally shift the data around to fit the narrative one wants, simply by framing the categories differently. I want to stress this point here. It isn't merely that folks can do so, nor even that folks do in fact do so, which they do all the time. It is that even if the scientist is being honest, not trying to manipulate, or fool, or anything of the sort, the fact that the categories themselves are so vague entails that the results are basically meaningless. If I categorize race, for instance, by self-identified as I will get one result. If I categorize race by blood quota, I will get another. If I do so by skin tone, I will get another. If I do so by state data, I will get yet another result. The problem is that there is no correct answer to this. Which, incidentally, doesn't necessarily mean there is no usefulness to it. After all, racism is real, y'all. There are real disparities predicated upon race. It is that the predication of racism, just like the category of race, is inherently vague. It is more or less made up. It means different things to different people. Note that this problem isn't actually solvable via having standardized naming conventions. All this does is mask the underpinning facts of the matter. Race is an inherently vague category. All a standardized categorization does is systematize all the errors to be within one of the many different possible vague categorizations. This isn't, in other words, a problem of lack of standard measurements. It is a problem with failing to understand the things being measured. Which leads to the related problem: what the data means to the people from whom it is being gathered also differs. Ask a person with ancestors that were black if they are black. They say no. Data collector says yes. How does one even really parse that out beyond noting that there are simply inherent problems with the set that demand they be interpreted in order to make any sense at all? Briefly note, compare that to the uncertainty principle. Again, things like nationality, which for some folks may seem like a simple category, turn out to be not so easily defined. We could define it as nation of origin or nation of residence or self-identified nation or nation of citizenship and so forth. Similarly, regarding behavior, much of what constitutes behavior is surprisingly vague. Honesty, for instance, is a strikingly vague sort of thing. Same with lying. We could produce some specific data that shows people being honest or lying in this or that set of circumstances. We may even hope that we could produce a set of circumstances that are neutral and which unambiguously show that someone is in fact being honest or lying. And yet, what those terms actually mean in other contexts are actually so radically different that the results are essentially useless. If we determine that folks are more or less likely to be honest in one set of neutral circumstances, does that entail that they would be more or less honest in a non-neutral circumstance? As in, are the results even applicable beyond the neutral set of circumstances? What does being honest or lying mean in situations where there are no definitive or clear answers, even in principle? What about relative to the individual? I could be honest, for instance, and say I don't know, but then, if pressed to give an answer aside from that, what would being honest there actually entail? My best guess? Is that being honest though? I could also lie and say I don't know, as in, there being no definitive or clear answers, even in principle. Saying I don't know can be construed as a lying statement. Such actually depends on the criteria of knowledge, which is itself a very vague category of concepts. Do I know an answer in a situation where there are no definitive answers? Maybe TBH winky face. Maybe the criteria for knowledge is far less than what folks might be inclined to think, as in, maybe knowledge doesn't require certitude, and hence when I say I don't know I am actually knowingly lying. Speaking of knowingly lying, might I unknowingly be honest? Unknowingly lie? The main thrust here is that even pretty basic kinds of questions get caught up in significant categorical difficulties, where those categories are foundational to both the questions asked and the kinds of answers given. This may very well be an intractable problem too. It is still worse than that though. It isn't merely in certain instances whereby the terms and categories used determine the kinds of solutions suggested. There is a strong suspicion that such may be foundational to reality. As in, even the hard sciences end up doing this sort of thing. The axioms upon which any given categorical take is structured may be little more than a choice, which ought be quite disturbing to people. To be blunt, the foundational structure of reality may very well be mutable. It is unclear as to what exactly that might entail, but at least partly one can get a hint at it from the preceding analysis of other kinds of categorical structures. There may be, for instance, a whole slew of different elements on the periodic table predicated upon different fundamental structures. If the fundamental structures themselves are mutable, the elements that derive from them are likewise mutable. To pick a certain set of axioms, say, the fundamental constants, and then build the matter-energy relations that would derive from them is not an impossible kind of thing. After all, there is a real-world example, namely, the real world. This relates to the data problems and the problems within scientific practice in fairly straightforward ways. Folks see what they want to see. They study the things as they are, predicated upon that which was presented to them as if it were the reality. There is little reason to suppose that the whole of the universe is like the little section of the universe the scientists are studying. There is no reason to suppose that the fundamental constants are indeed constant everywhere in the universe. That assumption on the part of scientists derives primarily via the scientific method, though not exclusively so. Partly that assumption derives from the philosophical and theological arguments that there is one truth, the notion of a singularity, or the hypothetical prion, or some other fundamental, as the name fundamental constants suggest. However, the sciences do in fact take this point to rather absurd extremes. Namely, through the introduction of the concept of fact. Facts can't be argued with. Facts just are. They are fundamental. One can argue over what the truth of the matter is, or may be. One can indeed argue that there may be multiple truths, a singular truth, both multiple and singular truths, even with the capital T, even within the concept of objectivity. One cannot suggest that there are multiple facts. Facts are fundamental, immutable. But of course this actually very well might not be the case. One can say, for instance, that the truth of the matter regarding matter and energy structures is that their structure is dependent upon the certain fundamental aspects that are themselves mutable. There may be, to use the current relevant parlance on the matter, a multitude of ways to finely tune those. The facts of the matter, of the energy too, are whatsoever the scientists happen to find, whatsoever they so happen to be handed at any given point. I point out what I take to be the most ardently stubborn of scientific fields, the most supposedly objective, even in theory, to make the point. But again, the point was already made in logic, philosophy, and mathematics quite some time ago now. The foundations of reasoning are axioms, these are brute, and there are different ones that folks can utilize to derive different sorts of logical, reasonable, and mathematical structures. How much of science is predicated upon binary logic? When, after all, there is such a thing as non-binary logic? How many categories are predicated upon an either slash or even a both slash and, without hardly even recognizing that there are more than two options? Even in theory. Even in principle. Even in the very foundations of the earth.
Papers everywhere.
In parsimony, folks may hope that these are not significant issues. They may hope that in fact there is something far more simplistic in the formal structures. They may cling to their favorite bit of science, their favorite set of papers, their favorite studies that confirm the things they are positive are factually correct. Alas, there is no one watching what the scientists are doing. Not even other scientists. At best there is a sniff test that is being applied in the peer review process. A paper is sent around, those already in the field, and hence already within the, gosh, I don't really want to call it indoctrination, but something like that, already filled up with the biases sniffing it. They get a sense as to if the paper even makes sense. That is the process in its entirety. There is nothing deeper to it. There isn't any deep evaluation given to the papers so published. It is more than the sycophantic way in which well-established folks within the field are wildly more likely to get published, though that alone ought ring every single alarm bell of any honest academic left in this world. It is that even when given a blind review, even when they are doing their job, it is literally just a sniff test. That paper vibes right. It is only after a paper is published that anything like a real peer review process occurs. Namely, even the possibility of there being a replication of the principal work, let alone an en masse critical analysis of the paper itself. Again, peer review is a sniff test and literally nothing else. Post-publication folks actually interested in critically analyzing the paper, what it says, and so forth, actually do so. Folks might want to try and defend the process. Perhaps that is the best there is, the most rigorous there is. I doubt it, but maybe. Perhaps folks will try to point towards their successes in this. Alas, the sniff test may merely show you who dealt it. Again, how many papers pass the sniff test because it meets the right vibes, confirms all the correct biases, because it doesn't rock the boat, or rather, it rocks the boat just the right amount. Enough that the folks reading it nod their heads along with it, yet also find just a wee bit there that sounds, oh, if not new, at least interesting enough to nod their heads to. Among the oddest of issues in the current, the system as it was set up was intended for elitist usage. There was, in other words, no intent for en masse use. This has created some problems that I don't think folks have really fully recognized. The plethora of people trying to publish, for instance, entails that there is a difficult time in recognizing anything actually novel or worthwhile. Just from a super practical perspective, there are only so many people who can do the reviewing of papers. There is only so much time available for them to do so. It is real work. It has likewise made it that folks find little reason to even bother to try and publish. What, after all, is the point? It used to be clear here, that going through the university system actually provided the rationale as to why someone ought to be published. Provided, of course, that they got good grades, did well, etc. I want to be obvious about that point. The university system was by design intended to be a means of doing far more than merely sniffing out or getting a vibe about someone. It was to really test people so that certain folks would be utterly privileged in the fields of relevance. To go through it and get good enough grades, to impress the right profs, to do the right sorts of things, all these were to provide for a good means of testing people such that upon graduation they would just naturally have the privilege of being published. Folks wanted to hear what those people had to say, because they were deemed bright by folks who were also deemed bright. There are vague vestiges of this that remain in the university system, but these days they mostly denote social elites, elite universities that are cost prohibitive, and so forth. Not intellectual elitism. These days, the notion of going to university to get a degree is something everyone ought to do. And I mean, I don't want to entirely deride that. But here I want to denote a rather troubling problem that has arisen from it, the loss of the intellectual elites. There are almost certainly folks who will say good riddance as they curl up to their favorite studies, or tune into their favorite demagogue, none the wiser for their university education in the end. The point, though, is firstly that even the capacity to do the work becomes undermined. To which direction ought the intellectual go? Which set of papers do they follow? Is it just a choice too? There are thought leaders in the current that take up the challenge. After all, there is no real direction being offered via the academic journals. Which ones would we even bother to pick up at this point? Which would we take seriously, and why? So in steps the pseudo-intellectual, the intellectual with charisma, the differentiation not upon ideas, but upon good looks. Absent a real intellectual elitist structure, all that is left is a sniff test, vibe with a tribe, and look to a charismatic leader. Secondly, in terms of social cultural structures, to whom ought folks listen to? When the intellectual elites are little more than a gaggle of tribalistic folks vibing out with their favorite pet ideas and pretty leaders, to whom is everyone else supposed to look to? Understand that partly this is the way it always has been. That is, intellectual elites vibing with their tribes, but there was greater structure to it, and more rigorous testing of the participants. Some of that can get into fairly obtuse points, and folks have to recognize the inherent elitism involved there, but here the main thrust is that just as with other social cultural structures, having some kind of intellectual elites, the leadership, is actually important. And having some kind of means of proper vetting so as to not be led by morons is likewise important. The problems in the current have to do with the eroding of the old methods, which to be clear may have been fine or good enough when not so many folks went to university, but in the current those methods simply no longer functionally operate. Prestigious journals often enough merely cater to prestige, and even within that there are so many people who would theoretically meet their criteria that it comes down to who you know, rather than what you think. Perhaps worse still, it comes down to what kind of PR you might be able to garner. The whole thing, in other words, is fairly off the rails at this point. This isn't to suggest that there might not be some aspects of the current that are worthwhile. It is far more to point out that the proper mechanisms of quality control that used to be in place are no longer there, and the new methods are mostly bunk. It is potentially, in other words, a good thing, maybe even a great thing, to have a population that is far more educated. Setting aside any and all supposed pragmatic benefits of doing so, speaking strictly in terms of concern for the intellectual endeavors, the search for truth, it may very well be the case that a larger pool of people provides for more chances of striking wisdom, or that a more diverse grouping provides for many different perspectives, which are valuable in the pursuit of wisdom, or that raising the low point entails a higher potential point.
It isn't all bad.
It really isn't. It is fairly easy to point to goods that have in point of fact stemmed from the sciences. Medical science has produced what our ancestors might justly call miracles. For that matter, computer sciences, various technologies in the world today, these are all miraculous, at least by the standards of the people who would have used those words to describe them. There are a host of goods that have in point of fact come along from science. This is basically undeniable. Or rather, one would have to take a pretty odd ethical disposition to deny them as being good things. The point of this short piece isn't to hold that science bad, boo. It is to counter the scientific delusional thinking that they developed things they didn't. To reaffirm the rather serious issues in the currents regarding the efficacy, believability, and trustability of science. To counter the belief that there is no other thinking aside from scientific thought that is valid. Not valid as in your feelings are valid too, but valid as in wow, that actually is effective truth-telling kind of valid. Logic, again, is not science. Mathematics is not science. Philosophy is not science. Reasonable discourse is not science. Technology is not science. Rationality isn't even science. Of these, philosophy in particular ought to be singled out as a source of theory-making, for better or worse. I'd also add in the current times for relevance that feminism is best understood as a part of philosophy. Tinker gnomes. Such seems like such a fine descriptor of scientists. Dwarves they are, to borrow a pointed bit from an obtuse source. Noses close to the ground, certain that they've got the whole thing in view.
Philosophical knife attack.